The rhythmic sound of heels echoed along the white corridor of the research facility. Amy Martin walked briskly towards the conference room while reviewing the final report of her new drug development project. The pearl necklace she wore captured the fluorescent light with a subtle glow. It was a precious gift from her mother, one she always wore at crucial moments. "Good morning, Director Martin." Several young researchers greeted her as she passed. Amy responded with a kind smile as she glanced at the dimly lit laboratory. The Research and Development Division she led was entering the final phase of an innovative cancer treatment. "Johnson, how did last night's culture data turn out?" "Yes, the results exceeded our expectations. Please take a look at this," a young lab assistant replied, offering her his tablet with evident excitement. Amy studied the graphs on the screen and nodded with satisfaction. The success of this project would have a huge impact on the pharmaceutical industry. "Excellent. At this rate, we should be ready for clinical trials next month. The side effects are less than we expected. It's all thanks to your guidance, Director Martin." The atmosphere in the laboratory was full of energy. In the 2 years since Amy had become head of the division, the team's performance had steadily improved. Her serene judgment and precise leadership had earned her the trust of the young researchers. At that moment, her phone vibrated discreetly. The screen showed an incoming call from the wedding planner. Amy hesitated a second before answering. "Martin speaking. Excuse the interruption, but regarding tomorrow's final meeting, Miss Carter's mother has made a special request." Amy felt a slight dizziness. The wedding preparations were also in their final stages. 2 months ago, her life had taken an unexpected turn when she met James Carter. He had visited the research facility as part of a real estate inspection, and his chivalry, intelligent conversation, and neat appearance captivated her instantly. Barely 2 months later, she had agreed to marry him. However, one event cast a dark shadow over that decision. It was the day she met James's mother, Patricia Carter. In a private room of a luxury restaurant, Patricia received her in an impeccable Chanel outfit and heavy makeup that tried to disguise the years. Her gaze slid over Amy with a mixture of scrutiny and disdain. "Oh, so you're a researcher. It's fine for women to work, I suppose, but in our family, wives are expected to take care of the home, wear luxury brands and always look presentable," she said with a tense smile. Her eyes scanned Amy from top to bottom as if calculating her worth. "Career women shouldn't have families. That's my belief. But since James chose you, I suppose I'll have to turn a blind eye, given the world we live in." Beside her, James only gave an uncomfortable smile, saying nothing. At that moment, Amy understood the reality that awaited her. Those words left a deep scar on her heart, but she was unfazed. With a serene expression, she simply smiled and replied, "You're absolutely right, Mrs. Carter. I'll do my best to be a good wife from now on." Patricia never understood the true hidden meaning behind those words. The morning of the wedding, Amy awoke in complete calm. Outside, the city of Boston glowed under the autumn sun. The maple leaves were as vibrant as the blush on a bride's cheeks. She sat in front of her dressing table and picked up her pearl necklace. "Ready?" asked her mother Carol, entering the room. Behind her, her father, Robert Brown, observed his daughter with a mixture of concern and confidence in what was about to happen. Amy smiled. "Yes, everything is perfect." Amy looked at her father through the mirror and replied confidently. Her pearl necklace shimmered in the morning light. "Everything is going according to plan," she said. He nodded silently at his father's words. The grand ballroom of the Four Seasons Hotel was illuminated by the soft light of the autumn afternoon through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The golden foliage of autumn reflected in the Charles River. More than 200 guests from Boston's high society were elegantly seated among classic European furniture. The golden bubbles of the champagne tower filled glass after glass, as the music of a string quartet enhanced the sophisticated atmosphere. Patricia Carter, in the latest Dior dress and an imposing diamond necklace, sat proudly at the main table. Around her, several influential figures from society gathered, listening attentively. "My son will finally have a proper family," she said with a refined smile. "His partner works at some research center, I believe. Well, I suppose that's how things are now." A murmur of contained laughter went through the group. Patricia smiled with satisfaction. "But I'm not worried. Naturally, she'll leave her job after the marriage. It's what's proper, of course. At that moment, the master of ceremonies stood up with the microphone in hand. And now we'd like to hear a few words from the groom's mother. Patricia stood up with a wide smile. She elegantly raised her champagne glass and scanned the room. Her eyes stopped at the main table where the bride and groom were. Amy held her gaze with a serene smile. Thank you all for joining us today to celebrate the wedding of my son, James. Patricia began in her rehearsed tone. The Carter family has contributed to the development of Boston for 3 generations. It gives me immense joy to welcome a new member to our distinguished family. She paused and her expression changed subtly. A touch of mockery appeared at the corners of her lips. And I have another wonderful announcement to make today, she said in a louder tone, looking directly at Amy. We finally have an excellent maid at home. Please feel free to make use of her services. Laughter spread among the high society guests as if they had witnessed a witty joke. Even James smiled slightly at his mother's words. But Amy's expression didn't change. In complete silence, she took her champagne glass and raised it elegantly. Her deep blue dress highlighted her distinguished bearing more than ever. Oh, Amy dear, it's just a joke. Don't take it so personally, Patricia said with a triumphant smile. Suddenly, there was movement near the entrance. Amy's parents stood up slowly. The solemn expression of Robert Brown, with his marked features and imposing posture, made the air in the room feel denser. Carol, standing beside him, looked at her daughter with warmth. And now for the real surprise, announced Robert in a firm voice. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The color drained from Patricia's face. James, too, was paralyzed, not understanding what was happening. The string quartet stopped playing. Even the sound of the champagne bubbles seemed to stop. More than 200 pairs of eyes turned at the same time towards Robert Brown. The presence of the CEO of the most important pharmaceutical company in Boston completely dominated the room. Amy stood calmly. Her pearl necklace gleamed in the sunset light. There was no longer any doubt in her gaze. She was ready to witness every second of the true surprise that was about to unfold. The expensive champagne glasses on the tables vibrated slightly, as if announcing the earthquake that was about to come. The atmosphere in the room became heavy and tense, like the stillness before a storm. Patricia looked nervously at Robert and Carol. The champagne glass in her hand trembled slightly. James, his gaze alternating between his mother and his fiancée, seemed unable to decide what to do. Robert Brown took the microphone slowly. Robert's bearing exuded the authority of a leader of a global pharmaceutical company. The atmosphere in the room hung in a delicate balance as if it were made of crystal about to break. Thank you all for joining us today at the wedding of my beloved daughter, Amy. A restless murmur went through the room. Patricia's face turned even paler. Amy Martin, no Amy Brown. Robert's voice resonated with undeniable weight. She is the head of the Research and Development Division of Brown Pharmaceuticals and our next vice president, who will take over next month. Carol stood up with a calm smile and stood next to her husband. And for those at Carter Real Estate, Robert continued, she is also your partner in the $100 million real estate development project. The room erupted in chaos. The Boston elite expressed their astonishment in whispers and incredulous glances. Patricia almost collapsed in her chair, casting a pleading look at her son. James didn't know how to react. We've been observing all of this as a social experiment to see how you would treat our daughter under the last name Martin, Robert said, with a brief pause before continuing. And today it seems we have our answer. Amy stood up gracefully. Her deep blue wedding dress shimmered in the twilight. There was no longer any trace of false modesty in her expression, only the authority of a born leader. Her voice resonated clear and firm in the silent room. Let me introduce myself, not as your servant, but as the person who holds the fate of your company in her hands. The sound of a champagne glass breaking against the marble broke the air. Patricia had dropped it. The broken glass on the floor symbolized the collapse of her pride. This is a misunderstanding, Patricia shouted, her voice trembling. It was supposed to be a joke. Everyone was laughing. Yes, Amy said calmly. And precisely that laughter is what we found problematic. From the corners of the room, some guests were already checking their phones. The Boston Globe had already started reporting the incident. Robert spoke in a practical tone. As of today, all new development contracts with Carter Real Estate are canceled. The room gasped. Furthermore, we will be reviewing all existing business relationships. The words weighed like a sentence. The Carter real estate executives jumped up, phones in hand. Decades of corporate alliances were crumbling before their eyes. Wait, please wait. For the first time, James raised his voice. His handsome face was now distorted with fear. I had nothing to do with my mother's behavior, Amy. Amy looked at him coldly. You have your share of responsibility, James. James was speechless. Why didn't you stop your mother's discriminatory behavior? He had no answer. His silence illustrated, better than any words, his own indecision and moral negligence. The guests began to rise from their seats. In high society, the rules are implacable. No one wants to be near a family in decline. Amy addressed everyone with her head held high. Ladies and gentlemen, what has happened today is not just a personal matter. She paused. It is a warning. Her gaze swept the room. A warning against the discriminatory values that still persist in our society. The silence was absolute. And against the prejudices that lurk beneath the surface of the so-called gentlemen and ladies of high society. At these words, many of the guests lowered their gaze. Guilt weighed on them. They had laughed along with Patricia. Now reality hit them. Carol approached silently and put a hand on her daughter's shoulder. You made the right decision, Amy. Amy nodded slightly. Patricia was slumped in her chair. Her expensive makeup smeared with tears. James was still there, paralyzed, unable to seek help from anyone. We're leaving, Robert announced firmly. Let's go. Amy nodded and took one last look at the room. Luxurious decorations, expensive outfits, refined manners. But now the ugly reality that lay beneath all that glitter was exposed. Amy turned one last time to Patricia before leaving. I probably wouldn't have been a good maid. She paused, letting each word resonate in the room. But as an executive, I will consider the future of your company. That was the final blow. Patricia burst into tears. Her imposing, elegant image was destroyed. Amy left the room with her head held high, flanked by her parents. A week after the wedding, the morning sun filtered into the conference room on the top floor of Brown Pharmaceuticals. Amy calmly browsed the newspaper by the huge windows overlooking Cambridge. Suddenly, the door burst open. Her secretary rushed in. Miss Brown, Mrs. Carter is here. She requests to see you. Amy slowly lowered the newspaper. Show her in. Minutes later, Patricia Carter entered the room. Her former arrogance had disappeared. She looked tired with little makeup. Although she was still wearing a designer suit, her demeanor was completely different. Amy, no, Miss Brown, her voice trembled. Please, I beg you, no more sanctions. Amy looked at her calmly. Sanctions? Her tone was quiet. This is simply a business decision. We have determined that partnering with companies whose values are discriminatory would significantly damage our brand image. Patricia frowned. But it was just a joke in a social setting. Amy narrowed her eyes. Don't you think that discrimination in a social setting is even more malicious? Her tone hardened. How can you call it social to humiliate someone in front of others? Patricia opened her mouth but couldn't answer. Her legs trembled. She started to cry. Amy raised a hand to stop her. It's not necessary. Her voice was firm. I don't seek your tears. I seek sincere reflection and a real change. At that moment, the door opened again. James burst in with aggressive steps. What does all this mean? His tone was desperate. Because of you, the company, our family, everything is falling apart. Amy looked at him coldly. Are you saying you have no responsibility in this? James remained silent. What your mother did was wrong, yes, he said nervously. But what about us? He paused. Your attitude was the real problem. Amy stood up calmly. Turning a blind eye to discrimination is the same as being part of it. The room fell into a heavy silence. The air felt dense. The weight of truth was undeniable. Outside the window, female researchers in white coats could be seen moving back and forth, focused on their work. Amy looked at the documents on her desk and spoke firmly. I will present our specific conditions. She took the first paper and read it aloud. First, the total resignation of the Carter real estate management team. She paused and took the next one. Second, the implementation of an anti-discrimination program within the company. Then the third, the active promotion of women to leadership positions. James choked. That's it. Amy looked up. Your family is also included, of course. Her tone was icy. We cannot trust executives who silently tolerate discrimination. Patricia clung to her son's arm. Her elegant, haughty demeanor had disappeared. Now she looked incredibly weak. As compensation, we also demand a donation of 30% of your personal assets to a support fund for the advancement of women in society. 30%? Patricia cried out in horror. But our lifestyle. Amy interrupted her with a cold smile. There's no need to worry. She leaned forward slightly. I'm sure someone will hire you as a maid. Patricia's face turned blue. Her own words had come back to haunt her. I expect your answer in 3 days, Amy sentenced. Otherwise, we will immediately cancel all transactions and take legal action. James tried to say something but bit his tongue. The facade of a gentleman that he had maintained for so long crumbled at that instant. You know the way out. Amy pressed the button to call her secretary. This is your last chance. Make a smart decision. When Patricia and James left the conference room, Amy stood by the window. Outside, the researchers continued working energetically. Just then, she received a long-awaited message from her father, Robert. The board unanimously supports your decision. Amy smiled slightly. This wasn't revenge. It was a necessary correction to discrimination that had lasted far too long. A few days later, the Carters' answer arrived. They surrendered completely. The society sections of the Boston Globe had new headlines. Carter Real Estate announces major reforms. Reflection on gender discrimination. New measures underway. Patricia Carter donates personal fortune to Women's Support Fund. From her office window, Amy looked at the Boston nightscape. The sunset reflecting in the Charles River seemed to announce the dawn of a new era. That night, she had a long-awaited call with her mother. Do you regret anything? Carol's voice had a hint of concern. Amy answered with conviction. Nothing. She leaned on her desk. This change was necessary not just for me but for all women. Upon hanging up, she reviewed the documents in front of her. It was a proposal for a new research and development project. The names of many female researchers were there. A year later in the fall, a major announcement was about to be made in the Brown Pharmaceuticals boardroom. The windows offered a panoramic view of Cambridge's autumn foliage. Amy calmly reviewed her notes before speaking. The new clinical trials have reached their final stage, with results exceeding all expectations. Her voice resonated in the boardroom. The market size is estimated at $500 billion annually. The board members murmured among themselves, impressed. The Wall Street Journal had reported on the project the previous week, calling it the biggest breakthrough in the pharmaceutical industry of the year. The research and development team led by Amy had achieved the unthinkable, developing an innovative treatment for cancers considered untreatable. An outstanding achievement, Robert commented, nodding with satisfaction. Your leadership has become the talk of the industry. Amy looked around the boardroom. Several female executives now occupied the seats that once belonged to men who never thought they would lose their place. Their presence was proof that change was not only possible, it was inevitable. After the meeting, Amy returned to her office. The future was just beginning. That morning, Amy was at her desk reading an article about the events of the past year. The wedding scandal hadn't just been passing gossip. It had shaken society, leaving a deep mark. Just then, Carol quietly entered the office. Don't forget we have a lunch date. Amy smiled and stood up. Of course not. Her pearl necklace shimmered subtly around her neck as she left with her mother. On the terrace of a luxury restaurant, mother and daughter contemplated the bustle of the city as they talked. Carol took an envelope out of her purse and passed it to Amy. A letter arrived from Patricia. Amy calmly took the envelope and opened it. Dear Amy, since that day, I have reflected a lot and learned more than I ever imagined. Through volunteer work in a nursing home, I understood that a person's worth is not in their titles or status, but in their humanity. I am deeply ashamed of my prejudices and arrogance, and the harm I caused. James has started from scratch, working in sales at a branch in the province. He too is facing his own weaknesses. Your decision tested our family, but perhaps it was the awakening we needed. We lost many things last year, but what we gained was even more valuable. I no longer need luxuries or recognition. For the first time, I feel I understand what it means to live with dignity. Please forgive me. Thank you. Patricia Carter. Carol watched her daughter attentively. It's quite a sincere letter. Amy nodded silently. Real change sometimes hurts. Through the restaurant window, they could see young women walking with firm steps, moving between the campus and businesses. Amy smiled nostalgically. Last week I gave a lecture at the Harvard Business School. She took her wine glass elegantly. The students' eyes shone with emotion. Carol looked at her with pride. You have become their role model. That night, Amy was on the terrace of her house, contemplating the night view of Boston. The city lights reflected on the surface of the Charles River, creating a dance of golden sparkles. Her phone vibrated nonstop. Cooperation proposals from pharmaceutical companies, interview requests from business magazines, invitations to conferences from associations of female executives. Amy Brown had become one of the most influential figures in the business world. But her mind was already on her next goal. Innovating in medical technologies, fostering more research, completely transforming corporate culture. There was still much to do. A knock on the door brought her out of her thoughts. It was her father, Robert. Ready for tomorrow's board meeting? Amy nodded without taking her eyes off the horizon. Yes, I have a proposal for a new project. Robert looked at her with pride. The future you seek seems clear now. Amy smiled. I'm just getting started. Real transformation doesn't happen overnight. But once it starts, it's unstoppable. The night breeze caressed her hair. Her pearl necklace shone softly in the moonlight. Now it was more than just an accessory. It had become a symbol of her strength and determination. The next morning, the headlines were clear. Brown Pharmaceuticals revolutionizes the industry with an innovative drug. Amy Brown, the leader transforming the business world. The executive who broke barriers and continues to challenge the status quo. In her last interview, Amy had said firmly, "If our generation doesn't change the world, then who will?" And she was already on her way to doing it. The next generation will face the same challenges unless we do something about it. Transforming reality is never easy. Sometimes it hurts, sometimes it demands sacrifices, but it is a necessary process. Society is changing, that's undeniable. And ensuring that change is permanent is the responsibility of each of us. A new sun rose over Boston, illuminating the city with a renewed brilliance. It seemed to announce the dawn of a new era, one in which old values have been left behind. Amy Brown's story continues to ignite a light of hope in the hearts of many, and that light, silent but unstoppable, continues to spread even now.